Thank you for listening to Taking Up Space. We would like to emphasize that taking up space is not a substitute for speaking with a licensed therapist or physician. We hope to encourage discussion around the topics brought up throughout the show. The views and opinions expressed are the speaker's own, and we can only speak from our perspective, and we encourage you, as our audience, to listen to all of the perspectives shared here with an open mind and heart, and then form your own. You can find us on Instagram at BIPOC Healing Podcast, where we also have a GoFundMe linked for any donations to help keep our center running. We hope you enjoyed the episode. The content discussed in this episode may be troublesome for people to hear. Before, during, and after listening to the episode, please make sure to practice some self-care activities, however that looks for you. Some of our favorite methods here at Taking Up Space include journaling, going for a walk, connecting with a loved one, eating a good meal, or just taking a few deep breaths and some time for ourselves. If you find yourself in any distress after this episode, please contact a licensed physician or clinician for further support.
Hey everyone, thanks for joining us on today's episode. So today we'll have myself, Rehana, we have Reena. Crystal's usually here with us, but today she is actually on vacation. So we have JeeHye, who's one of our counselors here at the BIPOC Healing and Wellness Center, as one of our guest speakers. So last week we talked a little bit about our the importance of BIPOC spaces and being among other people of color in order to heal, to feel that sense of familiarity and so on, and how important that is for all of our different cultures and ethnicities. And so today we were going to focus a little bit more on BIPOC in the workplace and how important it is to have spaces where we can work among other people of color. So yeah, I'm going to pass the mic on to Reena or JeeHye if there's anything you'd like to add.
Yeah, thank you so much for that introduction. I'm really excited to have this conversation. It's something that I think a lot of us here at the center are really passionate about, that we've noticed how valuable it's been to have a space of all BIPOC folks, sharing professional space together and supporting each other, being able to show up authentically as ourselves. And this vision that we've created together is exactly what I wanted going into starting the center after many experiences of racism in the workplace and just really abusive workplace dynamics. So I thought it would be really important for us to discuss that, because I'm sure that can resonate a lot for folks listening. So just to start off, I'm curious, JeeHye, did you have any experiences with previous workplaces, maybe experiencing racism in the workplace that felt like you wanted to share with our audience?
Yeah, one of the reasons why Rehana and I decided to run a group on women of color in the workplace facing discrimination and racism is because I personally have experienced myself in the workplace. As a racialized female social worker working in very white dominant spaces, I often felt like my identity was invisible. I think people didn't see color, treated me the same. But it's when I say they treated me the same, it's more like they thought they were treating me equally, but obviously I picked up on the differences. In my previous experience working in healthcare, there were many incidences where clients would say racist stereotypes or racist comments about other people of color, thinking that I was Canadian enough or white adjacent enough that I would somehow agree to these statements or to go along with what they were saying. So that was very common in my work as a social worker in the healthcare setting. But also I had a very negative experience where a client was making sexual and racist comments towards me, seeing me as a Asian woman, but somehow as exotic, or he saw me as a Asian woman instead of his social worker who was trying to help him. And even though I've mentioned that I'm a social worker, that I don't want to be treated this way, this didn't stop. And it got to a point where he was stalking me at work. He was always seeking me out, asking for me, wanting to talk to me, only wanted to work with me. And I had to set more boundaries, ask for help, and things like that. But it got to a point where I didn't feel safe at work anymore and had to go on leave. And when I did ask for help, like initially I felt very supported, but after a while I didn't feel supported. It's because instead of having this person removed, I was expected to return to work with this person still there and still being expected to work, which I thought wasn't really fair for me, especially when they have admitted that this person has caused me harm. But it was like, well, this is kind of how the work is, or this is what is expected of you. And I think in the podcast, we talked about imposter syndrome, like how for BIPOC people, imposter syndrome shows up differently. So as social workers, we're often socialized to believe that we have to be tough because we're often in very unpredictable situations, work with very vulnerable populations, and it takes a certain type of people to be able to do this kind of work. And as a social worker and as a person of color, I'm like, yeah, I gotta show people that I can do it, especially white people, white coworkers, white managers, things like that. So for like 6 months, I try to deal with this on my own. And I just try to toughen it out, deal with it as best as I could. But looking back, I wish that I had asked for help sooner. But the imposter syndrome was getting in the way, and I also am bad at asking for help because oftentimes I'm the one providing the support. I'm really not good at receiving help. So that got in the way also. I'm also the eldest daughter. I do things for everybody in the family, so that shows up as well. But what was really sad was that I even disclosed this information that I have history of sexual abuse to my manager at the time. And at first, like, he seemed shocked and, was supportive. But then later on, he asked me, so does this mean you can't work with people who have these kind of tendencies? And I thought, well, you never asked me that question when I was working with this person without any challenges, but then when this person started acting inappropriate towards me and then I raised concerns, now it became more like, well, maybe you need to set better boundaries. Well, does this mean you just can't work with this type of population anymore? So it felt like it was turned on me later on that maybe I wasn't a good social worker, maybe I just wasn't maybe I just wasn't fit for this kind of work. So that was very disappointing. And even going through counseling to talk about it, it was very stressful because I couldn't figure out whether I was being triggered by past events or being triggered with present things. And I think eventually, I realized I'm not just dealing with past triggers and past trauma, but I'm also dealing with present triggers of, racism and discrimination in the workplace and people not necessarily believing me because, of course, this person treated other workers differently, especially like my male coworker. This client showed up very differently in front of this person, like, yes, sir, yep, very polite, very different. And other people didn't experience what I experienced, so it was he said, she said sort of thing, and I also didn't document things very correctly or in depth because I think most of the time I was just trying to recover from the interaction or trying to tough it out. So that was very challenging, but when I took the time off to really process it, get support that I needed, it was great, but I hated that I had to be the one that had to step away from work instead of this person who harmed me. And I think oftentimes people don't think, Asian people, especially East Asian people, people don't think we experience racism or discrimination. I find as an East Asian woman, I experience particular kind of racism, discrimination where either I'm looked upon as submissive or exotic or maybe more traditional, I don't even know, or that I'm meek. Yeah, and then like people treat me a certain way, but it's all like implicit bias in a way, so people don't always pick up on it. And that's kind of what I meant when I said like people try to treat me equally, you know, like not see color. They think I'm white adjacent enough that like we can just be buddies. But the problem is racism is not individual, right? Like, I mean, there's individual racism, but it's mostly systemic. So, and oftentimes people are thinking, oh, I'm nice, I can just treat this person the same as everybody else, and you know, that solves the issue. But I'm like, no, just because you don't doesn't mean other people don't. Yeah, I don't know where I'm going with this now.
It erases the historical context,
yes.
right? Like, because when you think about it from a historical point of view, like in like after World War II, I think it was, like with comfort women, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's just been this historical abuse towards Asian women, and it's like for them to say, oh, this is just an individual issue. It's something that is like really deep within our like DNA that we're experiencing, and yeah, it feels dismissive for them to just like erase that as and just kind of blame you and say, oh, this is just something you need to deal with. You need to put boundaries here. It's like no, like this has been an issue for centuries.
Yeah, I'm so sorry that you experienced that in the workplace. That's so not okay. It's like that racial fetishization that is like a huge problem that a lot of racialized women face, especially like East Asian women. You know, that is how East Asian women have been stereotyped, and violence and sexual violence have been perpetuated towards East Asian women. So yeah, it's just like there's this bigger context here of what that represented to you, and it really sounds like your employer wasn't able to take that seriously enough, like didn't recognize the impacts of racism on mental health and how traumatizing racism can be for us, and really kind of put the onus on you as the professional to have to adjust yourself instead of like protecting and upholding your safety. Because the thing is, like, yes, we are professionals, but we are also, you know, we have intersectional identities as professionals. We have marginalized identities that need to be protected from allies. And when white folks in the workplace can't step in and do that for us, like that is so harmful. And it really also sounds like, I want to go back to what you were saying regarding like struggling to ask for help. I'm actually hearing that you did try to get help. You tried to vocalize your experience. You tried to be honest about what was going on and how it was impacting you. And what I'm hearing is that it was not like, it was brushed off because it was maybe the person responding had privilege and power where they don't understand how that impacts you, and they, you know, don't understand the microaggressions that they're perpetuating towards you by you know, kind of like letting you be in the line of fire like that is so harmful. And so I really want to reframe that as like, this is often what happens is like we try to get what we need in the workplace. We are not able to get what we need because these people with power, these white folks, are not able to give that to us. But then we shoulder the blame and shame for it. We think like, I should have done this. I should have asked for help more. I should have, you know, been better, like this and that. Then we start to kind of think about the situation about like, okay, maybe it was me. But I think what we want to highlight here is that it's not us. This is so much bigger than us. And that's actually a form of like racial gaslighting.
Yep.
That comes up, right? Where it's like, okay, it's just your problem. You need to deal with it, adjust yourself, and have boundaries because you're a professional. While erasing the human element to it, which is you're a racialized human being harmed by racism in the workplace.
I think oftentimes people are like, how could this possibly happen? Because, like you said, maybe they've never experienced it themselves. But I think what people need to realize is that these horrible things do happen to people at work all the time. Just because you weren't there when it happened or it didn't happen to you doesn't mean it doesn't happen.
Yeah, it's so true. And like, this is a bigger thing regarding believing survivors. You know, whether it's survivors of sexual violence or survivors of racial violence and trauma. Like, we need to believe people. You don't have to understand it personally or see it in order for it to be real. And I think that this is exactly what keeps perpetuating these cycles, is this kind of bystander effect that happens where people just like let this happen. They don't take it seriously, and it keeps happening over and over again. I mean, you know, here at the center, we work with so many folks who have experienced workplace racism. And we hear so many stories of things. And it's so layered because it is entrenched in livelihood and capitalism and means to survive. So a lot of times these are layers that work to silence us. You know, I remember, you know, one of the catalyst events for me founding the center was a series of like horrific workplace racism incidents that happened over the course of like a couple years, over a couple of workplaces, where I really felt like I am just this like token person who like checks boxes, the quota of what it means to have diversity in the workplace. And every single time that I would try to make real change happen for my racialized communities, there was always like a cap to how much I could do. It was always like, okay, we want diversity, but like only to this point. We don't actually like want you to be able to do all these things that your community like needs you to do, because that inconveniences us, that, you know, maybe like compromises like what we need in terms of our own I don't know, like our own best interests or like the interests of the people in power or funders in power. And so I just kind of like got so sick of constantly like being only seen as a certain version of myself, as like this modified, watered down version of myself that can benefit a workplace to the extent that they want and need, but doesn't actually like consider my needs. And I think like that is a tough concept for a lot of folks to recognize, is that like we are allowed to have needs in a workplace too, or we're not just getting paid to serve entirely, to give up our needs to the workplace or you know, for the people that we're supporting. Like, we're allowed to have needs too. And I think that's a concept that I didn't really fully grasp until even just like starting the center and being like, okay, I can actually do what I want here. And like, you know, I can share space with community the way that I want, and I can honor my needs and I can honor their needs too. You know, if a team member comes up to me and says, hey, like, you know, this is what I really need to be supported with, or like, you know, I need this time off, or, you know, I need this accommodation, I can actually be like, yeah, like, let's do it. Let's meet your needs. And I think it really like has started to like set in for me that like, this is that like we are allowed to like claim space, claim those needs. And maybe we need safe environments where we can do that, because what I heard from your story, JeeHye, is that that was not a safe environment for you to have needs.
No.
One thing that's coming up for me, and this is like really recent, because I'm thinking about Palestine right now, and I'm thinking about when I was like at a previous corporate job, and you know, the like after October 7th, the genocide that like progressed since then, it was like this big thing that people were like, oh, don't talk about it, don't be public about speaking up, because if you do, you're gonna lose your job. And in my mind, I'm like, what kind of workplace would fire someone for speaking up about a genocide? Like, that is terrible. And this was the only center that I actually saw, like, openly speak about Palestine and openly say, like, hey, we're offering free counseling for people who are struggling with this.
Yeah.
Like, this is a real issue. And I felt so safe. Like, when I saw that, I was like, wow, like, this is a center I want to work with, because, like, it's, like, so, like, it was such a night and day difference between, like, working for this corporation where it's, like, oh, like, just, you know, just, like, if you post about it, just keep it private, like, don't talk about it at work, just go to work and talk about, you know, like, typical workplace dramas, and then we're showing up to work knowing that a genocide is occurring, knowing we can't talk about it, and having to pretend like, oh, I care about, like, you know, what's going on in this, like, minuscule, like, space or something. Like, I don't know if that makes sense, but
Yeah.
even, like, right now as we're talking, I'm, like, thinking about, like, you know, Israel's bombing Rafah, and they're trying to push, like, the Met Gala, where people are paying, I think it's like 75 grand for a ticket.
Wow.
And that's just to get in, and then their dresses and costumes are like hundreds of thousands of dollars. And I'm just thinking, like, where is the value for human life? Like, going back to what you were saying, Reena, about like the value for our safety and our well-being, and, like, wanting to feel like we matter too. Like, there's nothing wrong with us mattering, but yet, like, when we look at, like, the people with money and, like, corporations and things like that, they have no value for human life.
Yeah.
Or human safety.
It really sends a message about, like, whose needs will be prioritized, whose lives matter.
Yeah.
And I think that is something that a lot of racialized folks are struggling with. And I think that's been a struggle, whether it's Palestine or, you know, speaking about issues that really matter to us and that uniquely impact racialized communities, that we are going to feel the trauma of in a way that, you know, maybe is not being recognized in the mainstream and amongst white folks. I know, like, when I was working at a nonprofit, and I had, like, signed a letter regarding defunding the police, I remember getting in trouble for that. Because it would compromise the image of the organization. So there were a number of us who were pulled into a meeting where we were told, like, that was inappropriate conduct, and that, you know, it would look really bad for our funding from, like, the police or from the government, and we were told that we're not Black Lives Matter, so we shouldn't be signing this letter. And I remember being in that meeting, and everyone was so, like, horrified, because all of us, like, were speaking out. You know, it was in the height of, like, George Floyd's murder. We were all speaking out because this is something we cared so deeply about, and I knew my colleagues and I all had similar politics, and, you know, really wanted to stand for justice while working with really marginalized clients who, like, you know, it is, like, life or death for us to stand for justice for them. And I just remember being so deeply impacted by that meeting as the only racialized person in the room. You know, like, I felt so traumatized from that conversation, where I was like, I cannot, like, my voice is being silenced. I cannot speak about things that matter, things that are impacting our community as we speak, things that are impacting the vulnerable clients that I'm serving and supporting. And that, like, kind of, like, cognitive dissonance, like, felt so, like, strong and disturbing to me, that it's like, okay, if I want to support the people who need the support the most, I have to, like, keep my mouth shut and not say things that matter. How can this be? How can I do the kind of work that I am called to do if I can't speak out? Aren't I just continuously perpetuating those same systems if I don't say anything? And that was the moment I decided, no, that's not going to be me. I won't be silent. I can't be. Our lives depend on it.
Yeah, that is so true. Yeah.
And I think that's why we joined the center.
Yeah, that's exactly it. We saw that. Yeah.
Like, I know I don't always have to be the one bringing up stuff, because the center would already have it on the Instagram, or will already be promoting it. I don't have to feel like I can't bring up stuff, or I don't have to come into work being like, oh my God, who's going to say something or is going to do something. Like, I'm not having to, like, prepare or be hyper vigilant of microaggressions, racism, discrimination in the workplace. I can just show up and just be me, and do the work. Like, I don't think I'm just seen as like a therapist or a social worker. I'm also seen as JeeHye, who's, you know, Korean Canadian, and with like all my intersectionalities and whatnot. And that's kind of what I was looking for in a workplace. People to see me for who I am, but also like beyond that, you know? You can't just see me from like how I look on the outside and then make judgments about who I am as a person or as a professional. But here, like for example, we'll do debriefs, but we're just talking to each other, connecting. Like we focus a lot on connecting and really validating each other. And at other workplaces I've been in, that would only happen with like one or two other people that I would consider as my allies, right? But here it's like I could probably do that with anybody here, you know. Of course, I feel like I've formed deeper connections with you two, because we've ran groups together and we've had long debriefs. But I also feel like because of the values that the therapists and other professionals that work here hold, I feel like if I want, I can probably do that with a lot of folks here, which feels like a very safe and truly an inclusive space, right? And this is not just for show. Like we don't just walk the walk or talk the talk. We walk the walk as well, and that's what I've always been looking for. A place that's transparent, honest. You know.
Yeah, I think that's so valuable, and you know, like being transparent, honest, and like about that human connection also means like, you know, owning up to things that maybe like might be gaps or biases that we have, or like mistakes that we might make. Like, you know, it's not to say that like here at the center we know absolutely everything and we're gonna get it all perfect. You know, maybe there might be something that we need to speak out about that maybe if someone on the team comes to me and says, Reena, this is really important, like I need to be open and receptive to that feedback of like, yeah, like let's do this, let's speak out, let's say something and do something for this, right? So I think we're not trying to promote this like idea that you have to like know everything there is to know about like equity and inclusion in order to be a safe workplace. I think it's like really working from a place of humility where you can listen and learn and be curious, and through that place of relationship, you know, figure it out, and not put it onto your staff to have to figure it out for you, but like listen to them and figure out like what is your responsibility as like a manager or a person in power. Like I always say that like I want to acknowledge the power that I have as a manager, as a director, but I want to have responsible use of that power. I don't want to use that power to harm people. If for any reason I do end up causing harm, I want to learn from it and correct it and make people feel safer. And I don't want it to be like this hierarchical power over. And I think that what I've seen in workplaces is there is that like hierarchical power structure, and there's this expectation that workers are just there to like, you know, do their job and do it super well, like, you know, be productive, follow these capitalist values. And it really does like erase the human element to like, hey, it's actually super normal and natural to be triggered when you're working with a white client who says something racist to you. Like, these are things that actually need to be acknowledged, that like that kind of comment is going to impact you differently as a racialized person than your white colleague. And I think that people are so afraid to address race. They're so afraid to talk about these things. When really what I've seen is that if someone in my previous workplaces had acknowledged my reality and actually cared to like hear about it through how I experience it, it would have made such a difference for them to like see it and to know that it's real. Because oftentimes, like when we go through it, we feel like we're losing our mind.
Yeah.
Like we really don't, like it's part of that gaslighting, right? We question ourselves. So it would have been so valuable for someone in a position of power to be like, I see you, I hear you, I believe you. Tell me more about how it is for you. What can I do to support you? That would have made all the difference.
It's like having integrity, right? Not just saying we care about diversity, and having staff from different backgrounds, and you know, there is no integrity in some of the workplaces we've been in. And what you just said reminded me of a coworker. So I had to go through WCB because of what had happened, and then this one coworker, she was helpful in being my witness, and what she did for me was that even though like things didn't happen to her, she really listened to the impact that it had on me and was able to be a witness in saying that, you know, like this didn't happen to me, but like seeing how she's very distressed, not being able to come to work, not being able to sleep, having like nightmares about this person, this experience, these encounters. She was really able to support me in that, and then I got my WCB approved and got the support that I needed. But if other people, like let's say for my manager, was able to provide that for me, I think I would have had such a better outcome. I don't think it would have taken as long for me to recover from that. And also I think I would have felt safer potentially returning to work. I ended up never returning to that work. I needed to get accommodation to work at a different team. But one person helped, but I wonder if the whole institution, whole organization could do that, like how safer it would be for people of color going to work in these white dominant spaces.
Yeah, that's so true. So it reminds me of, I'm curious, JeeHye, if maybe you could describe for us, like, we were talking about in our group, this difference between ally and accomplice. And I think that really relates to what you're saying here. So could you describe that for our audience, like what that difference is?
Yeah. So allies are great, but we prefer accomplices because allies show up when it's most convenient for them. But accomplices, or we would also call them co-conspirators, right, Rehana? They show up even if there's a risk involved for them. So maybe this coworker, by taking my side or believing me, maybe could have had a rift with the manager or with other team members perhaps, but despite that showed up for me and then was my witness and got my WCB approved, right? So I really appreciated that. But yeah, accomplices, even talking about, you know, the genocide in Palestine, if I'm gonna speak up even with potentially losing my job, I want my accomplices and co-conspirators to show up with me and also say, fuck the system, we need to speak up about this. Yeah. A lot of times people say they're allies, but I don't know if they even show up when it's convenient for them. It almost feels like a lot of times it's inconvenient. So, when is it gonna be a good time? I feel like it never is. And maybe people just need to let things go and then just show up as human beings and show up for connection, show up for liberation, you know? But it takes courage and it takes people to be able to, I guess, give up things that they have, especially privilege.
Yeah.
And that is not something that most people are willing to lose. And I think that's why we're still dealing with the things that we're dealing with, right? But yeah.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
That really relates to what we were talking about in a previous episode regarding, like, in order for us to take up space as racialized people, like, we need accomplices or co-conspirators to, like, give up that space for us, right? And I think people really struggle to be able to do that. When you are so used to having privilege, it feels like oppression to not have that privilege anymore, or to give some of that up, or utilize it in a way that could be beneficial for those who don't have it. So that is a big struggle that we see. And so I guess that makes me curious then about, like, what is the value of having, like, these BIPOC specific spaces versus integrated spaces with people with white privilege. I'm curious from your perspective, JeeHye, what do you think about that?
I think integrated spaces, when I think of integrated spaces, there is no real integration. I think maybe integration by outline, like in terms of like who is in that space, if they make sense, by number or by color or by like who's in it. But I think truly having just BIPOC only spaces mean we don't have to worry about white supremacy showing up in the workplace, implicit bias showing up in the workplace, or us having to put on this armor of, like, I'm ready to just clap back at whoever's going to say the most inappropriate thing to me today, or going to do the most inappropriate thing to me today, or just not agreeing with me, or even just saying I'm doing things wrong because I do things differently, for example, or me feeling not as valued even though people say they value me. I think what people forget is that just because you say something doesn't mean I feel it. And in BIPOC only spaces, I do feel truly valued, because I think I was selected for like things that I offer based on my like experiences, especially. And that is what's really different about this center compared to other places that I've worked in. Other places, they look at your education, they look at your work experience. They don't really ask about who you are as a person and what you bring to the table. They might ask you one question about it, but they don't really care. They're just asking you so they can say they asked that question, right? But here, even during it wasn't even an interview, it was a meet and greet, right? Even during that process, we really just talked about what we were really passionate about, why we want to do the work that we're doing, why it's important. And that in itself is already so different. Like, I know I can just bring up things like, oh, this person said the most racist thing to me today. Like, no one's gonna be like, are you sure that was racist? Are you sure you're not misinterpreting that? Or are you sure you're not just having a bad day? I know that you will show up and just be like, yeah, that's really fucked up. Yeah, like that shouldn't have happened. And that is something that I've always wanted, but really couldn't find out there. So I'm so happy I'm here.
Amazing. We're happy to have you here. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah. I'm also wondering, like, so some people might say, okay, so you have like a BIPOC only space. What about BIPOC folks who maybe like have some internalized racism or perpetuate white supremacist ideals? So I'm curious, like, what do we say to those folks who are wondering about that?
Oh, that's a really good question. Yeah, because it does exist. I mean, I think the hope is that, like, maybe being around, like, people of color of the same background can maybe, like, allow them a chance to actually explore that piece of their identity and just, like, being in that collective space, like, maybe they can, like, understand, like, wait, like, this is a part of who I am. Like, I don't have to, because I think a lot of people who, like, I guess I can't speak for everyone, but I find like when there are people of color who do try to like morph with like more Western ideals, sometimes it's done out of survival or a place of maybe like they don't feel like proud of who they are as a person of color, and so they try to like shun that side of them and try to fit as much as they can in with like Western ideals. But there's a lot of like feelings of empowerment that comes from like being within BIPOC spaces, and like I know BIPOC is not a monolith, so but even just having that collective that group of like, you know, shared understanding, shared experiences, being able to empathize with the fact that like, yeah, like we are from different minority backgrounds, but you know, this is a reality that we face and we can face it together, and like we're not alone in that.
Yeah, that's so true. Thank you for bringing that up. I think that really hits the nail on the head for what a lot of folks experience. And I guess like what I often look for is, you know, can we have this safe space together where we can explore these types of conditioning that we've experienced together, and like unpack and undo that together. So I look for like folks who are willing to like learn and unlearn that, because we all have internalized racism. We all have been conditioned with white supremacy ideals, every single person. But maybe what is unique about the BIPOC spaces and this space particularly is this is a space where we can kind of like set down that mask that we feel like we constantly have to put on to like face like, you know, white Western society, where we can actually get to our roots and start to unpack some of this stuff together. So I think as long as there's that receptivity to like looking inwards and seeing, you know, being self-aware and seeing like, okay, these are the ways that I'm continuously perpetuating that, and maybe these are ways that I could be harming others by perpetuating that. I think that's what's important in this space, is that, I mean, you know, again, we're not going to be perfect. We could misspeak or say something out of that conditioning, but it's like a recognition of like, okay, you know, catching ourselves, calling in, and really like gently like having that safe supportive space where we can let each other know like, hey, that was not okay, or like, hey, did you consider that this could be part of that conditioning? And then we can work through it together, not out of shame, but out of shared learning with each other.
Yeah, I think that one thing I would say is that, like, it's not your fault for having internalized racism, right? I don't think it's any of our fault that we have that. Like you said, we're conditioned. But I also want to invite listeners to maybe look inward, because we may be perpetuating harm to other people, but I wonder like what the harm is to ourselves when we have internalized racism. And I think when we can start from within ourselves, I think we can also extend it to other people.
Yeah, so true. Amazing. Thank you both so much for this conversation. I think it was so like enriching and really valuable to apply what we were talking about last week to now, you know, what that has meant for us in like our workplace experiences in the past, and also what we're co-creating together as colleagues.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for being here, JeeHye. And thanks everyone for listening.
If you are interested in further resources and readings, you can find some articles referenced in the episode description. Thank you for joining us on this week's episode. We would like to thank everyone involved at the BIPOC Healing and Wellness Center, our staff, volunteers, and community members. Special thanks to Kaven, Lanry, and Jeremy for the behind-the-scenes support. You can find us on Instagram at BIPOC Healing Podcast, where we also have a GoFundMe link for any donations to help keep our center running. We are extremely grateful for your support, and as always, we hope you take up some space, however that looks for you.